Hello again. I wanted to pick up on some things that occurred to me while I was listening to Sadako. The first is I should say something about the catalog. We have been working for at least a year and a half, if not longer, with all of the speakers today, apart from our commentators, contributing essays and the art historians' entries on all the works in the exhibition, as well as wonderful scholarly apparatus. We have information on reproductions and readings of all of the signatures and seals, and a very extensive glossary index. It should have been ready long ago, but in the process of working on this at crucial moments when the buck stopped with me, I've had some bouts of illness, and so the catalog is not ready yet. But it will be something you're going to want to treasure for a long time. So you can sign up in our museum shop to get a notice when it will come out. So I apologize to all of you, and especially to the Coles. But please be patient, it will come out. The other thing is, Sadako mentioned the Gutai artist Shiraga Kazuo, and by a very happy coincidence, we have some Gutai works on loan in the modern wing of the museum. That's the part that you get to by, if you go out from this auditorium and continue to your left and go upstairs, that's our modern and contemporary wing, and you can find that there. And that reminds me of a third point, is that if you go upstairs and go to your right, in the lower level we have another Japanese exhibition, Three Masters of Abstraction. It looks at three wonderful print artists of the post-war period in Japan, Hagiwara Hideo, Ida Shoichi, and Takahashi Rikyo. And this is an exhibition that was put together by the wonderful Erwin Lavenberg, indefatigable collector here in Portland, who has for the past 6 years worked as a volunteer helping us to catalog the Japanese print collection. And the exhibition pulls together works from his own collection and ours. It's beautiful and fun, and I encourage you to see that as well. So, turning now to my talk, poet portraits. Why at all, and why thus? I think that question was posed by Michael Baxendall, one of my favorite art historians, but I can't find it anywhere, so I'm no longer certain of its origins. As you enter the exhibition from the sculpture court, this grouping is amongst the first set of artworks you encounter. The calligraphy, which is now very familiar to you, a triptych, and an evocative landscape. They all celebrate the late 7th to early 8th century poet, Kakinomoto no Hitomaro. Here it is again, the work. I think that both Joshua Mostow and Sadako just now have spoken about this. I wanted to pick up on the question of the identity of the poet from about the 10th century forward. This poem seems to be clearly associated with Hitomaro. But if we go back to where it first appears, which is in the Kokin Shu, the collection of collection of ancient and modern poems, which was compiled in 905. It appears there as the 409th poem. And it's listed as anonymous, but there's a note appended at the end. Some say this was by Hitomaro. So at that point, which is about 170 years after what may have been his date of death, they didn't quite think that it was by Hitomaro, and several modern scholars would also follow that opinion. But once the association became made, it was an absolute fixed, idée fixe, in both poetry anthologies and, as we'll see, in the visual arts as well. But this same text, the Kokinshu, 905, in the Japanese language preface written by Kinotsuri Uki, identifies Hitomaro as the sage of poetry, uta no hijiri. Now, he is effusive in his praise of other poets, about Yamanobe no Akahito, whom Joshua introduced us to last night. He said, Hitomaro isn't better than Akahito. Akahito isn't better than Hitomaro. He sort of says they're both pretty good. But the only person he identifies as the sage, or even we could say saint, of poetry is Hitomaro. The second grouping is a triptych of poet portraits by 3 generations of the Tosa school. The Tosa were a hereditary family of professional painters who had been associated with imperial court patronage for many centuries. However, in the chaos of civil war during the 16th century, that link, that important patronage link, was broken, and Tosa school artists had to flee Kyoto for the port of Sakai. Tosa Mitsuoki, the artist who did the Hitomaro portrait in the center, came back up to the city as it begins its process of revival in the Tokugawa period. And in 1634, he obtained his life goal, which was to be named a post that his ancestors long ago had, head of the court painting bureau. This is both a rank and a sort of job title, one of great prestige. It doesn't mean that he himself was an aristocrat. He's an employee, but an employee who is very highly regarded. And his jobs would be creating paintings for any need at the court. So if a new building goes up and they need wallpaper, by which I mean fusuma or byobu, or if somebody's going to have a celebration of New Year's, or if a empress is going to give presents of painted fans to her ladies-in-waitings. You needed paintings almost as much as Imelda Marcos needed shoes. So this was his bread and butter, but it was prestigious, but it also guaranteed an income. It also meant that he is using, and probably with the position had greater access to, inherited family cache of drawings and sketches. Down through the centuries, hereditary families of painters, particularly the Tosa and the Kano school, would, when they saw paintings or when they were asked to look at or copy paintings, they would make sort of quick sketch copies themselves this is before that we have slides, before we have digitalization, before we have Xerox. They would make slides, and then these would be kept in enormous piles in the workshops, and then younger generations would do their homework by studying and copying from these. So it is a conservative tradition in which much of the goal is to carry forward earlier styles because of their deeply steeped in the prestige of tradition. Now, turning to, so Mitsuoki did the central figure, and I'll return to the triptych as a whole in a moment, but I want to point out Hitomaro's distinctive costume. He is wearing, maybe I'll start from the bottom. It's hard to figure out what he's doing here. He is seated on the ground, but not in the way that you and I might be familiar with how Japanese sit. This is not zazen. He doesn't have his knees folded up underneath him. He's also not seated like this. His feet are together. He's seated like this. And this is a pose we see over and over again in portraits of Han and Kamakura period courtiers. But his legs are entirely concealed under these wonderful billowing pantaloons in a soft blue silk with a medallion pattern. And then on top, he's wearing a tunic, a kind of closed neck tunic. It's nothing remotely related to a kimono here. A closed neck tunic in a white figured silk. But notice how the garment drapes loosely over his shoulders. This is a soft, robe. It's called Naya Shizuku, a soft robe. And it is the kind of costume worn by the upper members of the court aristocracy for all but the most formal occasions. For the most formal occasions, they tended to go to black. So that's, I just kind of wanted to point that out to you. The last is an early modern work, a painting done in 1901 by Kimura Buzan. There's no title inscribed on the work itself, but there is a title on the companion box. But without a title, I think that the Japanese audiences who saw this at the beginning of the 20th century would have immediately recognized the subject. Because, of course, the man standing on the shore is wearing a soft costume with unstarched, with a white tunic over blue pantaloons. If you see that costume, the only person who ever wears that costume is Hitomaro. But also, in the distance, we see ships disappearing in the morning mist. This work is a favorite of our director, Brian Fariso, and it's become one of my favorites too. And I want to thank Michio Morioka for including it in her list of catalogs for the exhibition. It may seem out of place by putting it in the waka and courtly culture section of the exhibition, but we wanted to make the point of sort of transition and revival, and also that when you come to modern times, thinking of 1901 as modern period, that now, through universal education, the circle of those who would get this iconography and appreciate this iconography is no longer that tiny group of 500 to 1,000 aristocrats who were all married to one another's cousins, but it's really the entire nation. Anyone with a grade school education would recognize and savor this work, and now we hope that you can as well. So all of these celebrate Hitomaro. In this painting, done in 1691, we see the repository of centuries of established tradition. This work can be traced directly to a model created in the mid-11th century. The model was, the circumstances for that painting are recorded in a number of 13th century texts. So the texts are 2 centuries later, but they cite intermediary sources. One of these, the most complete text, reads as follows. There was a man known as the Awata governor of Sanuki, Kanefusa. For years he had enjoyed waka, but he had no talent at composition. His thoughts dwelt constantly on Hitomaro, until one night in a dream he saw, at a place he thought might be West Sakamoto, notice how specific this is, plum blossoms falling like snow, though there were no trees. Just as he was thinking, how awesome, how auspicious, he noticed an elderly person off to one side, dressed in an informal gown, with billowing pantaloons of pale lavender over red undertrousers and a soft cap with a tall tail. He was a most unusual-looking fellow. In his left hand he held paper, and in his right hand an inked brush. He seemed to be deep in thought. Who could this be? Marveled Kanefusa, whereupon the apparition spoke, saying, as a reward for the depth of your devotion to Hitomaro over the years, I reveal myself. And then he was gone. So Kanefusa summoned a painter to record the vision, insisting that he do it several times over until he got it right. Okay. What was the source for this mid-11th century portrait of Hitomaro? Could it be that earlier portraits, lifetime portraits, had been passed down over the centuries but had been lost in the meantime? Absolutely not. That's not remotely possible. We can dismiss that possibility out of hand because as I've already noticed, this costume is a costume that comes into use in the 10th century. so 2 centuries after Hitomaru's lifetime. It also belongs to a court rank far above any rank that Hitomaru ever received. So in this work, and in general, in the whole entire genre of poet portraiture, historical accuracy is never the point. These are not portraits of people, they're evocations of poets, and those are different. Kanefusa's dream is cited as the authority for this image, and students of Buddhist art will recall that dreams were often cited as the rationale for introducing a new iconography, such as the famous yellow Fudo, the yellow version of Buddhist deity found in Ryakuji. However, several Japanese scholars have also persuasively suggested a connection to imported paintings depicting the Chinese poet Bai Zhuyi, Tang Dynasty poet 772 to 846. He was much admired by Heian period poets, and his works were well known. And if so, then Hitomaru images could be an early example of the adoption, and we could say naturalization, of Chinese prototypes. But let's pursue this a little bit further. These are not images related to Bai Zhuyi, but actually quite a bit earlier. I'm showing you an image from a book of a rubbing of tomb bricks created in southern China in the 4th century, and the subject is the so-called 7 sages of the bamboo grove plus 1. They had notions of plus 1 all the way back then. So the characters depicted are men who were active in the 3rd to early 4th centuries, a time of great political turmoil in China. The Han Dynasty had collapsed in the beginning of the 3rd century, and there wouldn't be a dynasty unifying China again until the end for quite some time. So these men, who were poets, musicians, and philosophers, were quite critical of contemporary government. And as they are traditionally depicted, the group, both as a sort of literary trope, these were men who wanted to escape the intrigues, the corruption, the sort of stifling atmosphere of court life. So instead, they gathered in a bamboo grove, and again we have very specific history, near the house of a certain Ji Kang in Shenyang, which is now in Henan province in China, where they enjoyed and in their literary works praised a simple rustic life. So this was contrasted again with sort of the corruption, the dirt of the court. Now, they also stressed a great deal in their writing alcoholic beverages, which are kind of the emblem, if you will, of personal freedom and spontaneity at the heart of their creativity. So what's interesting to me is that the stereotype established here, that a poet prefers the country to the city or to court, to an honest day job, you might say, and finds inspiration in wine and with a small circle of like-minded friends. This carries forward as a kind of the image of Chinese poets, especially to the Tang Dynasty poets, and somewhat beyond. The fabulous Meiji and early Taisho period artist Tomioka Tessai, who's represented by 2 works in the exhibition and a great personal favorite I know of, Cheney Cole's, refers to this well-known Chinese trope in this fun hand scroll called Obsessions. And I want to thank Michio Morioka for her wonderful work translating these texts and researching the biographies of these fellows. But here you see the Song period poet Su Shi sitting around with some friends telling ghost stories. But I want you to notice that their robes are open and their postures are kind of slack and their heads are back. In they are in high spirits, if not quite yet stupor. And the degree to which their garments are disheveled, I don't really want to model that too much for you, but anyway, is a sign that they have shed their inhibitions. And now in this untrammeled mode, they are free to create to their absolute heights. So keep that in mind. So now, I'm of course bringing back our Hitomaro and one of the rubbings, and you can see that Hitomaro, like the Chinese poet, leans on an armrest and he holds implements in his hands. But whereas the Chinese poet is revealing leg, I mean, isn't that quite outrageous? Hitomaro is very, very prim. I mean, everything is buttoned up. You can't even see his toes. And that will remain true of Japanese poet portraits. And and also the idea of finding reclusion, going away from the capital, that was total anathema to Heian period aristocrats. Being sent to the countryside was a form of exile. And it was just the worst possible thing that could happen to you. Nothing was a greater disparagement than to be a country bumpkin. So in the world of Heian period waka, so 9th to 12th century, when these traditions are established, being urban and urbane and also modeling decorum were the admired characters. So what we see, Hitomaro is seated, and as the Kanefusa description had it, in his right hand he holds a brush, in his left hand he holds a paper, and in front of him is a writing box with an inkstone. So we can trace the prototype from Kanefusa's dream quite specifically down through the centuries. We have textual evidence that in the mid-11th century, Kanefusa commissioned what we think is the first portrait. At least he claimed that it was the first portrait. He bequeathed that when he was nearing death to the retired Emperor Shirakawa, whose dates you see here. He lived from 1053 to 1129, and the painting, we're told, entered the imperial treasury at Toba. In the 1110s, a courtier and poet named Fujiwara no Akisue asked to borrow the painting. Apparently he had to ask many, many times before he got permission. And that he got permission at all is probably due to the fact that his mother had been Shirakawa's wet nurse. So that gave him a kind of personal connection that allowed him more direct communication than most people would have. So he borrowed the painting and he had a copy made, and then this there will be on the exam. In the 4th month of 1118, he hosted a Hitomaro veneration ceremony 900 years ago this April. A Hitomaro veneration ceremony. And that ceremony is described by many people in different diaries, so there's no question that it happened in April or the 4th month. He asked other people to write inscriptions on the painting. They set it up. It was a hanging scroll. They put it on the wall. They had a table in front, and they filled that with flowers, fruits, meats, and other kinds of offerings. They note that they were all artificial. And then he gathered together a group of poets who composed. So this happened in, as I say, in 1118. Now, the original, which had been returned to the imperial treasury, was lost in a fire. So we find ourselves by the latter part of the 12th century with the only extant Hitomaro painting in the collection of Akisue's family. And I don't want to go too much into this, but I think you have a sense from what you've heard from Joshua Mostow last night of the incredible importance of poetry in the social life at the Heian period court. And Akisue's family becomes a lineage of poets. They're called the Rokujo family after their 6th Avenue mansion. The 6th Avenue poets who are competing with another family for prominence. And emperors would sort of assign these families to compile imperial anthologies, taking turns because they're trying to keep peace in the kingdom and so forth. But so for the Sixth Avenue poets, this portrait, having this portrait and having the ability to have Hitomaro parties is central to their identity as poets that matter, as poets that you need to know. Then the Emperor Go Toba, whom you heard a great deal about last night, enters the picture. And Go Toba seems to take up an interest in poetry actually only after he retires from office in about the year 1200. And you might be wondering why emperors retire, especially at a young age. And there are various reasons for that. Sometimes they were forced to retire so that maternal relatives could control a juvenile emperor. But in this case, and actually throughout the 12th century, emperors retired because it freed them from the hassle of being so terribly controlled. You're having your life controlled by ritual from dawn to dusk. It meant that if you were retired, you could live an elegant life as a courtier. You still, of course, were not an ordinary human being, but you had much greater freedom. And so about 1200, he takes up an interest in poetry, and the way that he had done other things in his life with a sort of ravenous appetite. In the year 1200, he attended major poetry contests, starting at the Roca family almost every month. And by the end of the year, by the end of 1200, he has borrowed that painting, and he is hosting Hitomaro parties in his own palaces. And one of the courtiers who attends is a man named Fujiwara no Nobuzane. He was a fairly low-ranking courtier, but a man who was quite good, famous in his own time, at doing sketch-like resemblance pictures of his fellow courtiers. Nobuzane is the person whom Go Toba called on the eve of his departure into exile in 1221 to do a portrait of himself to give to his mother. And he's also credited with being the creator of the earliest extant hand scroll painting of 36 Poetic Immortals. And I show you here, I'm sorry for the quality of the photograph, the image of Hitomaro as it appears in that scroll. And I think you can recognize the pose, the cap, the soft costume. Now, I saw this work myself when I was doing graduate studies, and in those days we didn't have digital photography, so I would take 14 shots of everything. I'm using a ring flash, but this paper is coated with mica, so it's like taking a picture of aluminum foil. It's a wretched picture, but I think the detail is a little better. And you can see here the very distinctive quality of these so-called resemblance pictures by Nobuzane. It was later continued by his descendants. And the idea is that the bodies are fairly stereotypical shapes, but the faces are quite animated and quite individualized. Remember, of course, that this is an imaginary portrait. This is, Hitomaro is long dead, but he's also clearly looking at and inspired by taking his iconography from that painting that Akisue had made for his Hitomaro party. By an amazing chance of history, there is a hand scroll of a Buddhist saint that shows us a Hitomaro party taking place. And you can see on the back wall, there is Hitomaro seated in the center. He's flanked by two bird and flower paintings done in ink. There is the table of offerings in front, and then seated in the room, we have the protagonist thinking about his next verse. So this is it's really unusual to sort of have this kind of document of what these ceremonies would have looked like. So these ceremonies would proliferated, they spread out to larger populations, and we can find professional portraits doing, and I'm thinking about Maeda-san's distinction, hanging scroll formal icons of Hitomaru down through the centuries. What's interesting to me about the work in the Coles collection is its very specific configuration and date. We know that Mitsuoki himself did many, many Hitomaru paintings, but this one I think is especially poignant. It was done in the year of Mitsuoki's death, 1691, and he shared it with his family. The work on the right is by his son Mitsunari, and the work on the left is by Mitsutaka. But if you think about that from the viewpoint of the paintings, the son is on the proper left, which is a position of higher prestige, and the grandson is on the proper right. Clearly, he's thinking about the idea, there had already been the triptychs, as you saw in the hand scroll painting. So it's a triptych, but instead of birds and flowers, he has flanked Hitomaru with two of the greatest female poets of the 9th century. I don't have time to go into their iconography here. By the way, the question arose yesterday about women poets, and Professor Mostow noted that their number is far fewer than that of the men that are recorded to us. But I fear we would be too harsh if we complain about the disparity. On the contrary, just to the best of my knowledge, Japan is the only country to celebrate female writers at this early point in history. If we step back to ask the larger question, who gets portrayed? It says a great deal about a culture's values in terms of, and I mean, unless it's mom and dad or pictures of your baby, if we exclude funerary and ancestral images, which are found across the globe, portraiture in general, across the world, across societies, reinforces wealth and power. This is a wonderful painting that we've recently acquired here at the Portland Art Museum. It's in the European galleries of the Infanta Maria Ana de Austria. She is a Spanish princess, of course, and this was done at the Spanish court just before she left to be married off to the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Infanta, why do we have a portrait of her? Well, to record a beloved daughter who is going away and will never come back. But also, it's a royal portrait, a document of a woman of extraordinary wealth and prestige. The Japanese women poets are portrayed, not realistically, but they are portrayed at all because of their literary contributions. This is from the so-called Fujifasa version of 36 Poetic Immortals. This would have been a hand scroll that was long ago cut into sections. Hand scrolls of both the 36 poets and the poets of different competition between poets of different eras begin in the Kamakura period, and in modern times they were cherished especially in tea ceremony circles, where they would be cut up and remounted as hanging scrolls to adorn during the course of a tea ceremony. The person portrayed here, if we ask, what women are portrayed, they are the ones who appear in those particular anthologies. So the question of who, I think actually, and this question came up last night as well about the primacy of image or text, I think it's the popularity of the texts and then the sort of urgent desire to imagine the persona of the people in those texts. Although, interestingly, there are some wonderful exceptions, like the Suo handmaid that we also saw last night. She is not part of one of these two very influential poetic anthologies. So most of these women, then, are members of the court aristocracy between the 9th and the 12th centuries. Most of them are what Japanese would sort of call the mid-level aristocracy, so not the very upper tier, but girls from good families who got jobs as ladies-in-waiting and occasionally caught the eye of an emperor. The poet portrayed here is a wonderful exception. This is Saegu no Nyogo, the Vestal Consort, or Princess Kishi. She was selected, she is the daughter of an imperial prince, and was selected at the age of 7 to go off to Ise and serve the sun goddess as her shrine maiden. I just can't imagine what it would like to have been sent that far away from your parents at the age of 7, although she had a small retinue, and an uncle came along to continue her education. But then when there was a change in reigns, Emperor Murakami invited her back to Kyoto and soon afterwards made her one of his consorts. So she's the single poet of imperial rank, and she is normally shown behind a curtain of state as a sort of marker of her more distant rank. What I love about the Fujifusa version is that here she shows a very saucy lady indeed. So at this point, if we ask about poet portraits, why at all? The answer that surges to the front is that the writings of Japanese poets, whether men or women or monks, were read, studied, mulled over, debated, emulated by successive generations of aspiring poets. Without that sustained interest in poetry, the audience for poet portraiture itself would have melted away. And I'm coming all too late, I know I'm running out of time here, to the earliest and rarest of the poet portraits in the exhibition. Rendered as very simple line drawing with just a touch of color, this is also a fragment from a hand scroll of the anthology Joshua discussed at length last night, the illustrated competition between poets of different eras. This work, we originally had it as early 14th century. I'm now thinking that we can push it back a little bit, but it represents the stylistic tradition begun by Fujiwara Nobuzane, whom I mentioned earlier, and closely associated with his descendants across several generations down to the beginning of the Muromachi period, or about the 1330s. In this work, we see two poets seated facing one another, and they are both wearing not the soft robes that we saw with Hitomaro, but starched robes. Notice that sharp curve in the shoulders. So this is kowa shozoku, sort of starched, stiff robes. And this style came into fashion in the latter part of the 12th century, and the sort of the cusp as we move from Han into Kamakura. The people depicted here are, on the left, the retired Emperor Sutoku, who is a tragic emperor of the earlier 12th century. And then here is Seishinko, who was a sort of a ladies' man and sort of hail fellow well-met poet of the much earlier in the Han period. So these are men who never would have met in life. What Go Toba's interest was in the anthology, again, as Joshua said last night, was to put together poems, sort of match poems from poets from different time periods. Presumably, this is his personal selection of what he thinks is their best work. What's so wonderful about paintings of this anthology is that it's the painter's task to do what the poems perhaps not do, is to set these two people in a conversation, to set them in a sort of dialogue. And what I love here is the way that with very, very simple abbreviated lines, two entirely different personalities are established for us. The emperor, full-bodied, he's sort of secure in his seat, he sits back, he sort of occupies his space, whereas Hanayori on the right is scrunched, he's looking over his shoulder, kind of like waiting for the class bell to ring. He's sort of not avoiding the emperor. And this wonderful pairing invites us to invent all kinds of narratives about their encounter. what I think is so extraordinary here, and there has been some abrasion to the surface, but we can still see the extraordinary sophistication and refinement with which these figures, the faces, have been drawn. And I bring you back again the Satakebon Nobuzane, different, but I do think that it's within the Nobuzane tradition that this is carried forward. So now when we come to the question of why thus about poet portraits, there are in poet portraiture two parallel strands. On the one hand, we have the icons that carry on the tradition of the painting inspired by Kanefusa's dream, and then handed down in the Rokujo family of portraits, the imperial family, and then spread increasingly to a wider populations. On the other hand, starting a little bit later, probably in the 13th century, is the cheerfully amateur tradition of poet portraiture by members of the court aristocracy, the literati, if you will, of the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, who found in the creation and exchange of these works a way to express their membership in a group. In closing, I must add that in 20 years of college teaching, I never once lectured on poet portraiture, largely because I thought the subject was so incredibly obscure in the larger history of Japanese art, but also because there were so few examples in American collections. I thought my students would never see them. Now, thanks to the Coles and other collectors like Sylvan Barnett and Bill Berto, Mary Burke, John Weber, and also a few of the museums, this field is now well represented in North America and ripe for re-examination by a new generation of scholars working in both art history and Japanese literature. The circle widens and it now includes us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Maribeth. That was wonderful. But as you know, I'm a modernist, and my question is about what happens to poet portraits in the modern period. I know that we still have a lot of poetry collections, different kinds of hyakuni type things. Do we still have portraiture? And in the spirit of modernity, do we still stay with the same iconography, or is it more of a make it new, let's look at these guys in a new way kind of depiction?
The answer to that is another 3 lectures. One of the things, I didn't even bring up all of the works in the exhibition, but one of the really fun pairs of portraits in the exhibition is from the 36 Poetic Immortals, the 2 fellows, an abbot and a courtier by Iwasa Matebe. One of the things that happens in the early 17th century that is part of the phenomenon that we also saw with Goyose's court and the wonderful calligraphy album that we saw last night. There is an extraordinary revival of interest in classical court culture. And that's an enormous phenomenon that I can't go into here, but I just remember one fact that I read many years ago, and that is that Tokugawa Ieyasu, this guy running around in a leather skirt, who founded a military aristocracy, ordered his top military aides to attend classes on the tale of Genji taught by a courtier in Kyoto. So this is, so in addition to the sort of personal diplomacy and his interaction with Goyose, and then later we have a Tokugawa princess marrying an emperor, there's a clear policy of endorsing this on the part of the most significant samurai, and then of course I think very eagerly welcomed from the court itself, because now not only the imperial family but members of the aristocracy have something they can sell. They have been neglected and sort of also impoverished for a long time. So I think that was this wonderfully mutually beneficial moment. And we begin to get, at about this time, that and Tomoko Sakamura at Swarthmore College has a wonderful new book about this. Konoe Nobutada and others began to make portraits of these poets, particularly the 36 Poetic Immortals, in screen format. And so we begin to get, as you get different formats, they sort of take on different meanings and different nuances. The iconography draws on these Kamakura period models, but the treatment of the poets becomes much more playful. And once that model is introduced in the early 17th century, that gets carried forward. A significant new development, which there are some precursors in perhaps at the end of the 17th century, but especially in the 18th century, and how I got interested in poet portraiture in the first place. Yosa Buson did haiga, or sort of humorous sketches, haiga portraits of other haikai poets, and that's very lighthearted, like the texts themselves. When we get into the 19th century, as Joshua and others have shown us, well, actually as early as the late 17th century, this tradition gets spread into the world of popular culture through printed books. However, I'm not familiar, and so now it's a great topic to throw out to the graduate students in the group. I'm not familiar, apart from the haikai, Muson and his circle, I'm not familiar with portraits being done of contemporary poets in either the late Edo or Meiji or modern periods. So I actually don't know the answer to your question. Is there a graduate student working on that in the audience? Well, these topics for you to work on, yeah. But it's a good question, Sherilyn, thank you.
In the triptych that you showed, the female poet on the right was labeled Issei,
yes,
as a place rather than her name. Is that...
women at court normally took their epithets. We don't know their names, but their epithets are often place names. Taken from where their father had, maybe her father was the governor of Issei or her uncle was the governor of Issei. The great many of them, or they might have a name, Kunaikyo, that's a court office. Then they have epithets rather than real names. We almost never know their personal names.
The backdrop, is that of Issei?
No, the backdrop is a waterfall. And is John Teramoto here today? I worked long and hard to try and figure out why she is standing in front of a waterfall. I was able to find poems where, and this astounded me, Issei traveled with a bunch of other courtiers to down near, hello? Yes. Anyway, the mountains in Yoshino, they went off to look at waterfalls together. So there's some poems in the Kokinshu. There's a whole little cluster of poems about waterfalls, and she writes ones there. But I looked hard for other images of her standing in a waterfall, and I'm not the best at web searching, but I found one other painting of her standing in front of a waterfall in Setosa School painting. Are people in the audience familiar with other examples of this iconography? Joshua?
It's fairly standard. Tosa, you also see it in Ukiyo-e Nikuhitsu. So in her collected poems, the first part is often called the Nikki part, the diary part, and she composes a poem on the waterfall at Ryumonji. And that's, in the Edo period, it gets picked up on, and it's not too infrequent.
Now I can make that correction in the catalog. Great. Okay, so does that answer the question? Okay.
We've got one more here.
Okay.
So staying with that triptych, the painting by Tosa Mitsutaka
Yes.
of Ono no Komachi, she is burning a paper in the hibachi.
No, she's washing it.
Oh, so that's my question.
Yes.
What is she doing with that paper?
It's a long story which I will garble. It has something to do with, there was going to be a poetry competition, And she jotted down the poem that she was going to recite in an older manuscript. And Joshua, can you get the story? Sure. Okay, we're handing it over to Joshua.
So there's going to be a poetry competition, and one of her competitors, I think Kuronushi, finds a poem she's going to submit. And he then takes a manuscript of, I think, the Manyoshu, and writes it in there, so that then when she presents her poem, he says, no, 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 she's stolen this from the Manyoshu. Look, I have the manuscript to prove it. Whereupon, now this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but whereupon she then washes the manuscript in that basin of water, and the more recently added poem washes off, proving that he had added it and that she's... I think it's a no play or something.
That story shows up a lot, actually, in ukiyo-e prints, so thank you.